I was really honored when Roger asked me to speak here, also a little intimidated because there's people in this room who have probably taught me more about new media than they've learned from me. But for some reason, I get the microphone today. So what I want to do is put our struggles and opportunities in a slightly larger context, a much larger context, in fact. But first, just a quick introduction of where I come from. And it goes all the way back to when I was 10 years old. I was a nerd. I was a complete nerd, only we weren't called nerds then. We were called the unpopular kids. But I was fascinated with electronics. When I was 11, I saved up my allowance to buy the first CK722 commercial germanium junction transistor. That's nerdy. But what's really nerdy is that I still remember it's a CK722. That's nerdy. So I actually wanted to grow up and design computer chips. That was one of my goals. And so I went to school in Silicon Valley and actually began to take a number of physics classes. Because at Stanford at that time, you couldn't do electrical engineering as an undergraduate. You had to do physics. So I was taking physics. My hobby was writing science fiction stories. And I actually started to sell some of them. So I thought, well, this is interesting too. So I ended up basically with a degree that was split between physics and creative writing. And I had two job offers when I graduated. One was a summer internship down in Santa Clara with a chip manufacturer if I was going to go on and do my master's in EE. And the other one was writing for Rolling Stone. So I thought for about a microsecond and turned down Intel. I wasn't a futurist then. And went to Rolling Stone and had a great time. Rock and roll was very good to me, the parts I can remember. And ultimately, my two sides of the brain came together again when I started the technology column for Newsweek and realized right away in the 80s that digital was going to change everything about media. So by 1989, I'd talked the Washington Post company and Newsweek into letting me start fooling around with this stuff. And my first project in 1989 was done with Apple. And it was interactive multimedia that required a Macintosh, another monitor, a Laserdisc player, and something called HyperCard. It was about Tiananmen Square, and it took 2 trips to the car to get the parts to set it up. In fact, I used to say it's not really interactive multimedia unless it takes 2 trips to the car. But it was fairly successful, although there was absolutely no way to sell it. So that was sort of the start. And when I think back to that time in 1989, I knew that we were in for a long ride when it came to figuring out how we were going to make this into the next wave of journalism. But if you had told me then that 25 years later, almost 25 years later, we would still be struggling to figure this out, I would not have believed you. I mean, I was reading the history of radio at the time to sort of help me understand how hard it is for a new medium to get leverage. But nothing prepared me for what has happened over the last 25 years. And what's interesting is since I left the Washington Post company in 2004, I started my own consultancy called Practical Futurist, and I now work with all kinds of organizations, from manufacturing to electronics to television to lots of law firms, accounting firms, you name it. Everyone is worried about the future. And it has given me an interesting perspective because everyone is kind of going over the cliff right now. Everyone is panicked. Lawyers are actually now a really big business for me because the lawyers are really starting to hit the wall. This is not a good time to be a young law school graduate. Maybe worse to be a young law school graduate than a young journalism graduate at this point in terms of what's happening in the job market. So what all of this has made me realize is that what happened in 1989 and up till now is in fact an enormous sea change, much, much bigger than simply a little tweak in media. What we're really seeing is, I think, one of the biggest transitions in human history since, and this is my new comparison, since urbanization. This is kind of an abstract concept, so I don't usually trot it out this early in the morning, but 5,000 years ago, you know, it was a remarkable step in human society when we went from living in villages, where basically we were related to everyone, and if you saw a stranger out on the trail, you killed them before they killed you. That was how we lived. In a very short period of time, we went from living in villages to some of us inventing the city. It's a fascinating piece by Lewis Mumford on the natural history of urbanization. It happened really quickly. We moved into cities and had to completely reinvent almost everything we did. Where do you get your food in the city? Out there in the village, you stepped out of your house, you were in the forest, or you were on your fields. Now you were in the city. We had to set up a whole new system for delivering food. Had to set up a whole new system of social relations, because you were now living next door, not only to someone you might not be related to, but someone you didn't even know. So, in other words, that transition of urbanization, which was an enormous step forward in human society in terms of what we were able to do, caused us to have to reinvent almost everything about being human. I think virtualization is the next step. In a sense, urbanization took us one step away from physical reality. We were no longer living among our food. Virtualization is another step into an even higher level of abstraction. And what we're really doing is building an entirely new world on top of the physical world, what I sometimes call the virtualization of America and the world. So that's sort of the theme that I'm going to talk about, the fact that even though it seems now like so much of what we do, how we live, how we work, how we shop, how we meet our mates has gone into the cybersphere, there's actually much, much more to come. So today I'm going to talk a little about devices in the future, connectivity in the future, how this is going to affect the way that we deliver our content. But I want to start by just setting a level really quickly. We were talking last night at dinner about how easy it is to lose track of how quickly things happen and how rapidly things change. So it's useful. I'm going to be talking approximately about 2020. I always find that my corporate clients like to think out that far once in a while because they have 5-year plans, but nobody thinks out much beyond 5 years. And I think once you get past 2020, you're really dealing with science fiction. So 2020, 8 years from now, if you look back 8 years, that's the level set. And in 2004, there was no iPhone, there was no YouTube, there was a Facebook. It had about 10,000 members, and you needed a harvard.edu address to join. My favorite one, though, is a 24-inch LCD television, cost $3,000. Now, I waited a year. I bought mine for $2,400, which I'm willing to sell now for half price. But that's the speed at which things change, because, of course, now iPhone is on its 5th iteration already. YouTube uploads 60 hours of video every minute. Facebook is at 1 billion users. And that 24-inch LCD TV actually costs about $125 and works a lot better than the one I bought for $2,400. So that's what happened in 8 years. We will see even more change by 2020 because we have 2 exponential processes driving it. One, of course, is Moore's Law that we're all familiar with. I learned it in my physics classes at Stanford, the doubling of transistors on a chip. Now it looks like that Moore's Law will be true at least through 2022, 2023. We keep saying we're going to run out of space on Moore's Law, keep figuring out ways to extend it. So the iPhone of 2020 will be as powerful as, the basic super small, low-end supercomputer of today. The second law that I think is very crucial is Metcalfe's law. That's Robert Metcalfe, Bob Metcalfe, who invented Ethernet, among other things, some years ago said that the value of a network grows as a square of the number of people attached to it. So in other words, it's an exponential growth also, like Moore's Law. Classic example, Facebook, 8 years, 10,000 members to 1 billion members. So we have 2 exponential curves driving this technology. One, the social one of the network effect. The second, of course, Moore's Law. The other piece I'm going to suggest is that what I've seen over the last decade is I believe people are accepting technology more quickly than they used to. 2 data points. My banking clients all agree that it took a full generation to get people used to ATMs. In fact, we got the part about taking money out of automatic teller machines pretty fast. We were really good at that. But getting people to put money into ATMs took about a generation. So now let's move on from money to love. I was interviewing the first CEO of Match.com once, and I asked him one of my favorite questions, which was, what would you have done differently in 2000 if you had known the crash was coming? And he said, well, I would have been spending even more money if I knew what was going to happen. He said, because we had no idea when we launched Match.com that it would go from that online dating would go from being a pretty weird thing, kind of a little scary, to effectively mainstream, used by baby boomers in only about 8 years. But that's what happened. So a generation to 8 years to acceptance happening even more quickly. Final point on that is a couple years ago, I did a big project with AARP and Microsoft looking at baby boomers and their adoption of technology. Big question is, would baby boomers be like the so-called greatest generation? Which, although we hear great anecdotes about 80-year-olds surfing the internet, those are, in fact, anecdotes. A lot of the so-called greatest generation really got to being about 70 years old and said, you know what, 3 television stations is enough for me, and I kind of like having my phone attached to the wall by a cord, right? Baby boomers are not like that. We have moved into being sensible adopters, and the iPad is a perfect example of that. So I think some of the hopes that some of us might have had that traditional business models would persist in that generation, those hopes are probably not very realistic at this point. So that's just to sort of set the scene for 2020. So I'm going to talk first of all about devices and connectivity. In terms of devices, we're way past the laptop phase. Laptops are still important, but the smartphone and the tablet are clearly crucial. But it's interesting, when I talk about virtualization, I mean that we are connected all of the time to the virtual world. It's not something that we just check in every once in a while, or for many of us, every 10 minutes. It's something that we are constantly connected to, and it's in the nature of being a modern human that you are connected that way. So when you frame it that way, you look at the most portable device we have, the smartphone. I'm going to use this as a demo. It's about 6 months old, so it's not as smart as it was, but it will do. You look at this and go, okay, how does this connect me to the virtual world constantly? And the answer is, it seems like kind of a dead end. The guy who founded Qualcomm, whenever a cell phone rings in the audience and he's up there, he always smiles because he sells chips for mobile phones. He says, every ring is a penny in my pocket. But the rest of you can turn yours off, because actually I don't make it. You look at a device like this, and you say, well, isn't this a dead end, kind of, The screen can't be made bigger and still fit in a pocket or a purse. They're making the keyboard smaller, but they're not making fingers any smaller. So a dead end, kind of. But just very briefly, I was at the big GSM show in Barcelona. That's the largest mobile wireless show in the world. Little frustrating for Americans, of course, because we're a bit behind the rest of the world in wireless technology. So you see these really cool phones from Asia and Europe that we're not going to get for another few years. It is a really good show for futurists, though. American futurists. I just go to the South Korea booth, pick up all the pamphlets, come back. I have seen the future. That's a trade secret. 2 guys last year did just a quick demo with a phone like this. They put a chip on the front that about the size of a sugar cube that projected a keyboard, a virtual keyboard in bright red light on any flat surface in front of the phone. You can buy those today, but they're peripherals. They add on to the phone. The next generation is chip-sized and can be built in. It also does taps and swipes like a tablet would. So that was on the front. On the back, he put a device that was quite expensive at that time, but it was about the size of a stick of gum, only a little thicker, and that was a Pico projector, ultra-miniaturized LCD projector that at a distance of 3 feet threw a 20 by 30 full-color, high-resolution image on any wall. So now you had this device that you ran around and used like a regular smartphone, but if you wanted something more substantial, you just sit it in a stand, you had a keyboard here, and you had the screen up there. Now, is that going to happen? We'll see. Fujitsu, actually, not to be outdone, brought a pen computer. Now, this was a prototype. It won't be possible, but it will be possible by 2020. It was a pen that you took out of your pocket, had little tripod legs, and you set it down, and it projected the keyboard and the screen. So we'll see if that happens. I think before that happens, one of the end games, as close as we can get to an end game of this technology, and this is where I get into the dangerous territory for futurists that sometimes is like flying cars. I never want to be the futurist who predicts flying cars, since they've been predicting them for so long. This sounds a little like the flying car prediction, but heads-up displays. A couple of years ago, I started to talk about this, and it sounded really crazy. But now the Google founders are all running around with Google Glass. Heads-up displays, when you really start looking at them, begin to make some sense. I had a pair made for me. It was a prototype. I had to give it back, but it's an Israeli company that's doing some of the internal technology. One of the more sophisticated versions. It looked like glasses like these, only quite a bit chunkier. They still have to work on the styling. But it connected by Bluetooth to my mobile device and projected the screen of my mobile device out in front of me. It looked like it was about a 50-inch screen floating in front of me wherever I went. And just as an example, I had an Android phone at the time that was programmed to give me my location on a map. So I went on the street, looked around, said, where am I? And in a few moments, it localized me, it brought the map up, and I was looking at a map of where I was superimposed over the physical reality around me. And those of you who follow this closely know that there's all kinds of augmented reality programs now that overlay information on physical places. Weird as it sounds, I think heads-up glasses are going to be popular by 2020. Because when you think about it, first of all, look at how many business people walk through airports with those blinking Bluetooth headsets on. I mean, they're starting to make those look more like pieces of jewelry because people are wearing them. Consider today's 10-year-olds. I mean, heads-up goggles are not going to be a leap for them at all. In fact, it may save some neck vertebrae because they won't have to walk around like this all the time. And there may even be a boomer application, just as an imaginary thing. I invented my own application for heads-up goggles, and it's called What's Their Name? And you could do it today. It's trivial. These glasses have a camera built in here, and you'd basically have it voice programmed. So you're walking along the street, you see someone coming towards you, you have met them, but you can't remember their name. You simply say, what's their name? Very quietly, and your glasses take their picture, go out, search LinkedIn, Facebook, Google Images, do facial recognition, come back a microsecond later, Michael Rogers. Go, hi, Michael, it's good to meet you. I'd pay for that. Heads-up goggles. So that is the kind of connectivity we will have 24 hours a day. And even if we're not actively doing things with the internet, the objects around us, our cars, our refrigerators, everything will be connected to the web. That's going to be the nature of virtualization. And a final step, even if you don't want the Google glasses, there will be screens everywhere. Screen technology is going to be so inexpensive by the time we get to 2020. I mean, for most small businesses, it'll be a no-brainer. You buy big electronic display screens. You don't go to the print shop anymore to have posters made. Much cheaper to do it electronically. When you look at the technology in a tablet, a low-end tablet could easily run less than $50. When you look at what's happening with the miniaturization of the radios, of the processors, and by 2020, the OLED business, organic LEDs, will be a much bigger piece of the screen industry. LCD prices will continue to come down. So we could conceivably see the beginning of disposable, recyclable tablets by 2020. And what's interesting to me is that's one of the big advantage paper still has. Paper is recyclable and disposable. We haven't been able to match that in electronics. And for a long time, I thought it would be decades before we could, but it may happen much more quickly than we think. So one way or another, you will always be connected to this virtual world. And what will connect us is the fact that by the end of this decade, there will be far more low-cost wireless broadband, I think, than any of us expect. There truly will be ubiquitous broadband connectivity on the same level as electrical connectivity. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive to some people. As a nation, we're number 17 in the world at broadband connectivity. In some cases, we see the cost of wireless data actually going up. But there are a number of forces in place that by 2020 mean things are really going to change. First of all, there's a lot of new technology that has not been rolled out yet for making wireless broadband much more efficient, using spectrum much more efficiently. Number two, we haven't even started to use most of the spectrum from analog television. Remember when we switched from analog television to digital television? That freed up a lot of spectrum that the engineers call beachfront spectrum, because it is the most valuable spectrum in the electromagnetic frequency range. It goes through buildings, it goes around mountains. That's why we gave it to television in the first place. That is being turned into broadband connectivity. And then finally, and when you look at the nations that have really forged ahead with broadband connectivity, you notice two things that are different than us. One, they tend to be smaller countries that are more compact. That gives them an advantage in running wires. Number two, they have governments that actually push the idea of broadband connectivity and implement plans to make it happen more quickly. In the United States, we've been very hands-off. That's why we're so far behind in wireless technology. We allowed the marketplace to fight out the standards on cell phones, while the rest of the world said, well, we're going to have one standard and we'll build on that. So we of course, spent billions and billions of dollars on competing standards and ended up probably slowly gravitating towards what the rest of the world uses anyway. But the same thing has gone on to some extent with broadband connectivity. But about 6 months ago, the FCC announced that they were going to make a change in the Universal Service Fund. Universal Service Fund is that tiny, mysterious charge on your phone bill that goes to, say, a fund that says wherever you are in the United States, no matter how remote, you can get a voice telephone line for a reasonable cost. Now, the Universal Service Fund is now being rewritten to say that wherever you are in the United States, you will be able to get a 4 megabit broadband connection up and down at a reasonable price. That's actually a profound step for the government. It's the first time they have really said, look, this is truly important. And you've seen the sea change at the FCC just even in the last year. It's very clear that making broadband connectivity available to everyone, particularly in remote areas and in the inner city, is absolutely paramount to this FCC. So by 2020, I think kids born in 2020 will have to be taught what offline means, because online will literally be the normal state of things. Most everything in your life will work better when it's connected to the internet, including your car. So those two things are important. What that leads to is suddenly when you're that connected, the idea of the cloud becomes even more sensible. Everything happens in the cloud when you have a constant connection. And of course you can lose your connection, and many people will say, well, that's always going to be the problem with the cloud. But you know what? You can lose your electricity too, but that doesn't mean we don't use electricity. So the connection to the cloud, where we keep lots of information, our data, et cetera, will be very important. But the constant connection to the cloud will have one other impact that is more subtle, and that is the accessibility of much more intelligent software than anything we're using today. I've covered artificial intelligence for many years, and the joke in the artificial intelligence community is that artificial intelligence is anything a computer can't do. In other words, they're a little frustrated because they make a breakthrough, they get a computer to do something really amazing, and everyone says, yeah, well, that's just a computer. But they keep proceeding. And what happened now is a combination of really great new algorithms for artificial intelligence and the enormous power you can now have in the cloud have come together. The best example is IBM's Watson. I'm sure some of you watched Watson, at least the YouTube clips of the Jeopardy playing computer Watson becoming the world champion in English of Jeopardy. It played the two leading American champions in Jeopardy and won soundly. A lot of people said, well, that's kind of a one-trick pony. IBM built something that played chess a few years ago. Now they built something that does Jeopardy. No, Watson was really a profound breakthrough in a couple areas. One, amazing recognition of natural language, because it was playing Jeopardy, in which the questions, which are actually answers to questions, have puns, double entendres, very subtle. And number two, it's general information. It's a lot of information that has to be sorted through and pulled together. And what Watson did was keep enormous amounts of information in live memory, not on disk, but in live memory. So that combination gave a machine that, my favorite example from Jeopardy was this one. The two humans were already a little worried. Watson was beating them. And so, you get to choose a category, and the humans got to choose, and one of the categories was chicks dig this. And you could just see their faces light up. Okay, something about women. Computers can't possibly know anything about women. We're going to do chicks dig this. And it turned out the category was female archaeologists. So the first answer was, Kathleen Kenyon's excavation of this city mentioned in Joshua showed the walls had been repaired 17 times. Beep. Watson had it. It's Jericho. Humans are still trying to figure out Joshua, what's Joshua? So, in other words, just look at that one clue. It figured out that Joshua was a book of the Bible, not a person. So anyway, Watson won, is now the world champion in Jeopardy, but has retired and moved to the West Coast, where Watson is learning to be a doctor. That's the next big application. Now, IBM has not released anything. They're working with WellPoint, which is an insurance company. It's private, so they haven't released any information. But I have some sources within WellPoint that tell me Watson is a killer diagnostician. They have Watson sitting next to diagnosticians, to doctors, and basically Watson can produce a diagnosis on the basis of evidence faster than the doctors can open the manila folder. Now, IBM has no intention of replacing doctors with Watson. In fact, their humanitarian vision is Watson is this entity that you can call from anywhere in the world and get a second opinion if you're a doctor. But we'll see. But it's doing very well at being a doctor. And its next job, by the way, it's going to go into training as a lawyer. So, which is even easier than being a doctor in terms of what IBM thinks the challenges are. So, what's interesting here is this idea that this intelligence is going to be available to all of us. In other words, Watson operates on an enormously complex infrastructure that you could never fit on your desk, even the biggest server in your back room. But once you're connected to the cloud, you have access to that. So here's just one example of how in one profession that kind of power can be used. I do a lot of work with lawyers. And so they do they're interested in language. So I'm going to pick lawyers to talk about for just 1 second. Lawyers are finding one of the big panics for young lawyers is that in the traditional law firm structure, one of the things you do with your young associates is discovery, that process where you go pre-trial, go through all the information and sort of sort out what's important and what's not. And, you know, the big law firms used to use squadrons of young associates that they would bill at $300 an hour and pay $60 an hour to go through and do discovery. Well, for the last 5 years, there's been a move towards e-discovery because more and more of the evidence is digital to begin with. So e-discovery software has gotten more and more sophisticated, but a real breakthrough happened when, for a complicated set of reasons, something called the Enron corpus became available. The Enron corpus is now famous in e-discovery research. What it is all of the electronic documents from the Enron case are in the public domain. They're not quite in the public domain. You have to pay a researcher $300, I think, to get access to it. But it is all of the evidence in electronic form from the entire Enron case. It's millions and millions of emails. And we know what all of that led to in terms of the nature of the conspiracy and the crimes. So having the Enron corpus means that they can feed it through software that begins to really analyze what you look for in e-discovery. And I'll just give you one example. They discovered that when executives start to talk about something that is illegal or they really don't want others to quite understand, their grammar gets better. And they were able to compare thousands and thousands of emails and see that when they start to talk about something that the feds might be interested in, the grammar gets better. So they just simply go through now and pull out every time a given person's grammar has suddenly improved in email, and chances are they're talking about something that shouldn't be brought to light. That's the kind of thing that e-discovery is beginning to let us do. Now, I'm going to talk a few minutes later about something called the New York Times corpus. Has anyone heard of the New York Times corpus? Yeah, it's the equivalent of the Enron corpus, only really for journalism. So let me finish with just an anecdote really quickly that from Steve Jobs. I knew Steve for many years. Steve wouldn't talk about the future that much unless he had something to sell or someone else's product to diss. But once in a while, finally, actually, about 10 years before he died, I managed to get him to talk about the future a little, and I just wanted to share this story. What I did was I said, Steve, what kind of computer will you be making when you're 75 years old? And he thought for a second, and he said, well, okay, it's going to be, let's say it's a tablet. This was before Google Glasses. He says it's a tablet, incredibly thin, flexible, super high resolution, enormous amounts of local memory, incredibly robust connection to the cloud, voice input, voice output, and lots of intelligence, both in the cloud and locally. So he said, you get this computer and you open it up. Maybe it's your 12th birthday. It's your first adult computer. Take it out of the box. It says, hi, what's your name? And you say, oh, I'm Steve. And it says, oh, Steve, pleased to meet you. This computer becomes the center of your 12-year-old life. All your movies, books, music, correspondence with friends, homework, everything you do, your schedules, everything goes through this device, okay? Now, so far, that's not that much different than today's sophisticated computer-bearing 12-year-old. But this is a very smart computer. So Steve says, for example, you've got your computer and you're walking along on a Wednesday afternoon and the computer says, Steve, where are we going? Because it's got GPS, it knows we're walking. You say, I'm going to my tennis lesson. And the computer says, do we go to our tennis lesson at 3 o'clock every Wednesday? If so, I'll remind you from now on. So it insinuates its way into your life. It becomes a helper and someone who actually predicts what you're going to need next. And then Steve finishes the story this way. He says, and then one day you're 17 years old. It's Friday night. You're up in your bedroom. And the computer says, Steve, why aren't we out tonight? And you say, I just broke up with my girlfriend. And the computer says, Steve, it's the third time it's happened that way. Do you want to talk about it? So I have learned not to bet against Steve Jobs. That's kind of intelligence we may well be talking about. So the other important piece, besides this intelligence in the cloud that we see evolving across all industries, is a drive towards standards. And when I say that, it's two kinds of standards. One is simply technical standards, the kind of stuff that drove us crazy in the 80s and 90s when this program didn't work with that program, when this didn't plug into that. Those days are gradually going away. The technical standards battle, while it's still going on, with 2.5 billion customers and counting, the worldwide internet is really driving us towards open technical standards, and that's a trend that is not going to stop. What I'm more interested in is standards within industries, XML-based standards that are creating what we call the semantic web. So for those of you who don't follow the jargon, the semantic web is really quite simply, if you look at a spreadsheet on the web today and you see the number 17, you go, 17 what? Go up to the top of the column, miles per gallon. Okay, that's 17 miles per gallon. If you cut that 17 out of that spreadsheet and put it in a spreadsheet somewhere else, now it's just 17. It loses its identity. The semantic web means that every piece of data has XML attached to it that says what it is. Data that knows what it is. That's simply what the semantic web is. Every industry I know is moving towards this because it facilitates putting all of your operations machine to machine rather than having to put humans in the way. One example is the construction industry, where in a system called building information modeling, everything that goes into a building will have a specific XML identity, doorknobs, hinges. And basically, when the architect does the blueprint, everything in the blueprint is identified with a specific piece of XML. You can print it out like an ordinary blueprint, but when it exists electronically, everything has an identity. So when it's time to get your bids, you send this out electronically to the contractors, who send it out electronically to all the distributors, and they're able through, rather than printing out spreadsheets and saying, okay, 25 hinges and putting a price on it, it all happens automatically. Someone wins the bid, and here's the most interesting part. Someone wins the bid, starts to build the building. Remember, this is the future, and we're always connected to the internet. So the blueprint is always connected to the internet. So maybe halfway through construction, the company up in New Hampshire that's making the doorknobs changes the spec on the doorknob. This happens all the time in construction, especially long projects. Well, in this new model, the factory in New Hampshire changes the XML coding. The blueprint actually knows. It notifies the blueprint, and the blueprint tells the contractor a spec has changed on some of the hardware. You better take a look at this. And then ultimately, that blueprint then turns into the operating manual for the building. So another example of XML in the information area is the travel industry. The travel industry really fought XML standards for a while. It was very hard to get them into it. I've done a lot of work in the travel industry, and when the internet came along, there was Expedia, Travelocity. They were really freaked out because travel suppliers manage their inventories very closely. So they weren't sure they wanted to have a common language. Now they're moving towards a common language. A simple XML code that a rental car night, a week on a cruise ship, a double bed in a hotel, all of these things will have specific XML connected to them. And the reason is not that these travel suppliers have suddenly come to like each other. That's not the case. It's because they now know that in 2020, a traveler who gets off an airplane is going to want to have on their iPad or their goggles, something that shows the map through the airport, coupons for 10% off on the stores that you pass as you go towards your next gate. It's the future, but we haven't fixed everything, so your plane is going to be an hour late. It tells you that. It also says, I've called ahead to the hotel. I've told them that you're not going to be there. I've also arranged the rental car delay. And by the way, Paul McCartney is going to be playing in Los Angeles, your final destination. Your friend Mary is also in Los Angeles now. You both like Paul McCartney. Shall I get tickets for both of you? I'll tell you how they know about Mary in a second. And Paul McCartney will be playing somewhere forever. So the travel industry knows that's going to happen. And they don't know if it's going to be Google or TripIt or company yet to come that puts this together. But they do know that if their services can't fit into that, they will be out of business. So now, of course, the news industry has been working on XML standards for a while. And probably our librarian certainly has followed this. There's 5 or 6 attempts now to do XML standards that begin with some fairly simple definitions. This is a headline, this is body copy, etc. Just a little bit of additional information on top of HTML. But it's becoming much more sophisticated. And the goal is to have XML and intelligence that's capable of really parsing an article, algorithmically producing links without human intervention. And the New York Times corpus turns out to be an important piece of that, because the New York Times they don't do it anymore, but for decades they had a team of about 7 people down in Lower Manhattan. They weren't in the newsroom for some reason, but they were in Lower Manhattan, who wrote descriptions, who summarized and tagged every single story that the New York Times published. And it's really, beautifully done. Painstaking handwork done over decades. So now the New York Times has released the New York Times corpus to researchers who can use that to sort of begin to figure out how you can build algorithms that are super intelligent and can do sort of much of the back-end work in journalism that we use humans to do now. So there's a level of automation, I think, coming ahead that is going to be good news in terms of lowering costs. So standards. I think by 2035, there's some Harvard Business School professor who's going to write a paper saying, we attribute the increase in productivity in the United States between 2018 and 2025 to the fact that industries finally adopted digital standards. That's the difference that it will make. So the other piece, I'm not going to talk about millennials too much. I mean, I think you've all done lots of research around millennials. We can talk about it later. One of my jobs at the New York Times was actually doing research on millennials. It got to the point where people said, Michael's going to be arrested for impersonating a millennial. I should be so lucky. But, I don't think there's any surprises there in terms of preference for digital over paper, et cetera, et cetera. I think a more important definition, for millennials, especially the younger millennials, is their ability to create and maintain meaningful virtual relationships. I think that is the sea change, particularly in millennials under 25. Some researchers want to divide that group, the 10 to 30-year-olds, which is now generally called millennials. They want to divide it into 10 and 20 and 20 and 30-year-olds and call 20 to 30-year-olds senior millennials. I love that. I mean, telling a 26-year-old you're now a senior. But it's because the online social habits of the 10 to 20-year-olds and their younger siblings are so different. So that's something to keep in mind, is that our audience is beginning to relate on to themselves in a virtual world much more than they used to. And that's where social networking becomes, like the semantic web, another way that we'll organize information. And of course, we're already doing this with social news, but I think we're just at the beginning of what we're going to do in terms of using digital personalities to organize information. Just very quickly, in this virtual world that we're building for 2020, I think we will all have digital personalities that we carry with us, just as we do in the real world. We have our personalities, who we know, our close friends, our relatives, our likes, our dislikes. That's our personality. carries with us in the physical world will have the same kind of container in the virtual world. Now, how this gets built, I'm not quite sure yet. Facebook would like to be your virtual personality. Generally speaking, the rest of the world is not crazy about having a single company own that. But we'll see where it goes. But as I tell retail clients, in the physical world, I can go into a store. If I've never been there, I see a friend of mine across the aisle. I say, oh, do you shop here often? Is this nice? And they'll tell me, yeah, here's what's a good deal. We need exactly that same experience in the virtual world. So we will carry these digital personalities with us, and that will organize information. And here's a thought experiment that we did at the New York Times with Yahoo. Yahoo, which is, of course, still trying to decide what they want to be when they grow up, but at one point decided they would be the place that aggregated all of your social information. They wanted to be the digital personality. So we did a little prototype for them. It's 2020, again. You're sitting in your living room in front of your 170-inch LCD TV that cost $5, and I bought for $10,000. You got 5 friends, and you want to watch a movie. But this is the future, so that's a problem. Every movie ever made is available streaming right now. So how do you decide what to watch? Yahoo's theory is they would be the ones who go out and look at Netflix and Amazon, all your preferences, what you've rented, what you bought, what you've rated, et cetera, munge all this information together for all 5 of your friends and come back a microsecond later and say, here's 5 movies none of you have seen that I think you will all like. And then the New York Times gives you a capsule review of each one, and we get a nickel for that. So that's the business model there. So that's the power of having these digital personalities. These digital personalities, I think, in some ways, I'm going to make one other quick prediction that sort of ties into this, and that I'll come back to in a moment when we talk about monetization. I think that by the end of this decade, almost for sure, we're going to see legal identities on the internet. We're going to see internet passports or driver's licenses. And they will be similar to driver's licenses in the United States. You don't have to have one. You don't have to have state-issued licenses in the United States. If you want to get on an airplane, it can be really handy. And that's, I think, the way the Western democracies, which have been very hands-off about internet regulation, the Western democracies have, that's the way all of them are moving. But all of the Western democracies see that we need some kind of real legal identity on the internet. So we will have that, I think, beginning to emerge by 2020. And that's going to make a lot of difference in terms of regulation, privacy, the ability to enforce things like intellectual property rights, and it will make it easier to tie a digital personality to something that's much more secure. So that whole social piece, I think, is what we're really watching, is the evolution of the digital personality. So the one other quick thing I want to say, I'm going to finish by talking about content and monetization. It seems to me one of the biggest shifts, the sea change in content that we're seeing is overall in the audience a decline in long-form reading. I think that we have passed through the golden age of reading, where being a really good reader was necessary to understand the world. Now, I write books, and I want everyone to read books as much as possible. So I'm not actually saying that this is a wonderful thing, but I almost got lynched at Yale once when they thought I was saying that the end of the golden age of reading was a good thing. So I always have to say that. But the fact is, today, a person can actually learn quite a bit about the world without having to read much more than 20 or 30 words at a time. And we're beginning to see that for millennials, their media consumption has increased in every single form of media over the past 10 years, except for reading. That has declined. The Department of Education last year found that only 30% of 4-year college graduates can read an entire book and then summarize it in their own words. And in other words, what they were looking for was the difference between long-form and short-form reading. There's no doubt that short-form reading is heavily influenced by the internet and really reinforced by the internet. Long-form reading, I suspect, is going to become a very specialized skill. And it's not because anyone's lazy, or it's just sort of the nature of the medium. And what it always makes me think of is my mother, who was a second grade teacher, because she felt that that was the age at which it was make it or break it for reading. And she felt reading was the most important thing a kid could have. If they got out of second grade without reading, they were going to be in trouble for a long time. And she had great stories about little Johnny. He wasn't interested in reading, et cetera, until she found out he liked antique cars. And she'd bring in 5 books on antique cars, and he'd start reading them, and Johnny became a reader. Well, now if Johnny wants to learn about antique cars, there's videos, there's slideshows. He can learn an awful lot without having to read more than 100 words at a time. So I think broadly, that is probably the biggest content shift that we're going to see, is a move away from the long-form reading. And at the New York Times, I pursued this in my own interests and did a lot of work around slideshows. Slideshows, taking a 3,000-word article and boiling it down into 75-word captions. We actually did some research around that and discovered that really 75-word captions in a slideshow probably reach far more readers than putting up a 2,500-word article by itself. Another piece that we worked on quite a bit was how do you hypertext without text? That is to say, how do you hotspot video so that it's possible to simply have a video that runs and you can click parts of the video, go out, come back into the video narrative. That, I think, is the direction that content's going to go. And it's the direction I think most of us are taking it already. That leads us to the final and sort of trickiest piece, which is the monetization issue. And this is something that every medium I work with and every industry I work with is struggling with, because it becomes quite clear as a rule of thumb, no matter whether you're a television station or a photo agency or a newspaper, when you move into the virtual world, you make about 1/10 as much per customer as you did in the physical world. It's interesting. That seems to be almost a rule of nature across everyone I talk to. And of course, everyone I talk to thinks they're the only industry this is happening to. And it's really unfair. But it makes me, I go back to my first job at Rolling Stone, and I think about how the music industry has adopted. And very briefly, what the music industry has discovered, and other industries are finding too, is that in the virtual world, you often sell what you used to give away, and you give away what you used to sell. Now, very briefly, what you've probably seen happen in the music industry, when I was covering rock and roll, a group would go on tour behind their newest CD. And often the tour tickets were reasonably priced. Tours broke even or sometimes lost money. They were basically marketing for the CD. And you sold t-shirts at the shows, but you made them cheap because you wanted to make sure that when you left town, every kid in town had a Led Zeppelin t-shirt, because then they would go buy the CD. So everything was basically seen as a marketing cost behind the CD. Now it's completely flipped. I mean, most people in the music industry think that the value of recorded music is approaching zero for the general audience. What is valuable is the audience will buy t-shirts. They will spend $500 to go to a concert. So concerts, live performances, and merchandise are where you make your money. And, record companies are moving towards the 360 deal, where they not only sign up an artist for their music, but they sign them up for 360 degrees, everything they do. And it's interesting, the other piece that has emerged from looking at the music industry, I now live in Brooklyn, which is sort of the world's headquarters of indie bands, is this. There's sort of a new business model for bands. It used to be that in the rock and roll world, you were either really poor in your garage, or someone had signed you, and at least briefly you had a $1 million contract, right? There's very little in between. Now, with sites like MySpace, bands can form and really reach fans individually. Fans will actually sign up to be members of a band's group of followers. Before a band goes on tour, it will ask, for example, if it's going to do a bus tour through the Northeast, it will ask in all of its fans in the various Northeastern cities, will you come to a concert on this given date? And they'll get numbers. Then they'll go to the venues in Boston and Portland and say, look, we've got 300 people coming in. What kind of deal will you give us? So it's actually possible now to make kind of a middle-class living being a rock and roll band. It's much harder now to get really rich. It's a mixed blessing at this point, because a lot of bands actually find that catering to their fans is a full-time job, and they'd actually rather be making music. But that aside, the key element here is what they have learned is that if you reach a reasonable-sized audience that really, really likes you, you can make a decent living. You don't have to be a Justin Bieber. So that's an interesting case. Now, the giveaway sell issue, I have seen a couple examples of this. One was, I was working with a company out in California that had an enormously successful business selling environmental reports that usually reside in county seats, in offices. Everyone who buys commercial property needs to get the environmental report that was last done on the property for legal reasons. And in years past, it was really hard to get these. They were all in filing cabinets, et cetera. So this company actually went out and scanned all of these, and they had them a database of environmental reports from all over the United States. And if you were an environmental engineer, rather than go pull it out of some filing cabinet, you just sent them $100 and they sent you the environmental report. Well, about 10 years ago, they realized that this business was going away, that pretty soon environmental reports would be online, engineers would just be able to log on, download things. So what they did is they realized that their website, where you could order these things, had actually become kind of a hub for environmental engineers. And so they began to build up the social aspects of their website, began to do more training through the website. The website was moved from the sort of marketing and sales cost to the revenue-producing cost side of the revenue-producing side of the ledger. And then they stopped investing in scanning documents. They just stopped that. They took all that money and put it instead into buying proprietary map databases so that they owned that. And they've done very, very well. But they were looking at a complete drop-off, and essentially what they ended up doing was, as I say, giving away what they used to sell and selling in terms of this very powerful social network, selling what used to be free. Photo agencies are doing something a little similar. It's interesting to watch how the photo agencies have adapted to, and many of you probably work with the photo agencies. I worked with an association of them, and they were really hit by the stock photo, the sort of the iStock, the whole micro stock phenomenon. I talked to the president of one who said he knew it was over when he picked up an issue of Time magazine, and it was a photo composite, the cover with clouds in the background, and he read the photo credits, and the clouds had come from a microstock agency. Time had spent 50 cents for that picture. And he said he went back through his records, and in the 80s, one of their biggest sellers at this agency was pictures of clouds, which cost $300 each. So what the agencies have done is two things. One, put much more money into making their search software really intelligent and quick moving. So now, your art director at the agency costs you, say, $250 an hour. If you can go to the expensive agency and use their fast software rather than going out and spending a lot of time going through microstock trying to find a picture, you've saved money by using the more expensive brand. The second thing that they're beginning to emphasize in their sales is what watermarking, which initially was done, of course, to prevent piracy. Now they see that there's a second sales element to watermarking, which is you can go to Citibank and say, look, if you buy an image from us that becomes your dominant image, that young couple under a tree watching the sunset, becomes a dominant image of an international campaign, we'll guarantee you that it doesn't appear anywhere else, even if pirates take it and put it up. So it's beyond piracy. It's actually giving the corporate purchaser the confidence that that image is not going to show up anywhere else. So something that they were doing as kind of a defensive action, in this case, becomes something for sales. So our business models. It seems to me, and I've now gone through the paywall argument quite a bit at the New York Times, and with actually people in this room, we started out with paywalls in the media business. It amazes me to think in 1993 and 1994, AOL paid Newsweek $1 million a year for our content. We signed a contract for 2 years and argued a lot. Should we sign a 2-year contract or just make this a 1-year contract? We decided to sign a 2-year contract. Thank goodness, because the commercial internet had come along, and in the second year of the contract, AOL just wanted to get out. The value of our content suddenly was dropping really, really fast. So when the commercial internet came along, for those of you who weren't around, the idea of selling content just didn't make sense. A commercial internet site in 1995 and 1996 was a horrible experience. I mean, it was really, really bad. So even if we had put up paywalls then, I don't think we would have had a whole lot of takers. I think things have changed. Because when we did that back in the mid-90s, we all said, you know, we're going to make it up on advertising because the internet is going to be the best advertising medium ever developed. And we were right about that. We were wrong, though, that, number one, we didn't realize that, in fact, everyone on the internet was going to be able to sell advertising. We were now competing against an enormous number of places, from video games to word processors, for advertising dollars. And number two, we didn't see that, ultimately, advertising targeting was going to begin to be disconnected from content. And that, of course, is what's happening with ad networks. It's what's happening with geolocation. Certainly, all of us in media are struggling to make the argument that advertising connected to a specific audience that is defined by content has value. And there's no doubt about it that that is the case, but we are fighting an uphill battle because the automation of advertising delivery is, as I say, separating advertising from the necessity of content. So that's why I think at places like the New York Times, we saw paywalls as inevitable. And I'll say one other thing about paywalls. Even if you look at a paywall now and you say, well, you know, we're losing, you know, in terms of the revenue lost, this doesn't make sense in the short term. I think it makes sense in the long term because, for starters, it puts a floor value on our content. And I think one of the battles we're going to fight over the rest of this decade is over the ownership of intellectual property. Right now, it's a very gray area. What is fair use? I think we're going to find more and more work around and legal battles around what is fair use. And honestly, if you're giving it away for free to begin with, it's much harder to go into court and make a fair use case. This is all part and parcel of what I think is a larger move on the internet towards, not to sound right-wing about this, but law and order. The sheriff is coming to the internet. There is just no doubt about that. A lot of internet entrepreneurs do not want to see that happen because it's been really good not having the sheriff around. I think the ultimate direction, though, of the virtual world, the fact that it's going to become as important as the physical world, means that we're going to start to see more and more focus on law and order. I think that's going to include intellectual property. So paywalls will become, I think, more effective. The other thing, the argument that I often hear is, well, you've been giving it away for free. I mean, how is anyone going to go pay for this? Well, the important note that I would make here is to look historically at HBO. When HBO came along, it was the first pay for content. You know, previous to that, CATV had only been used because you couldn't get over-the-air signals. That's why you paid for it. Suddenly, HBO came along and said, you know, we're going to have you pay for the content that you think you used to be able to get for free. HBO had a very hard time making that argument until the mid-70s, when there was a writer's strike during the peak of television production in Hollywood for an entire season that wiped out new content on the 3 networks. And it's interesting, HBO immediately went into, it was the first time they'd tried free sampling. They let people have a free sample for a month during the writer's strike, and people stuck. That was the turnaround for HBO. So in other words, when quality free content is not available anymore, it's possible that people will turn to paid content. That's why, you know, even though I have very mixed feelings about paywalls in terms of the larger world of reaching our audience, I'm actually happy that the Washington Post is talking about having a paywall, because if we can remove a lot of quality content from the free marketplace, I think ultimately the lesson of HBO means that we're going to see more and more revenue come in. Past that, you know, what do we do now that's free that we can start selling? Community is one thing I've thought about quite a bit. Monetizing community, creating something very broad. It's something, you know, we've talked about for a while, but really making the newspaper, the news site, sort of a membership club that has a whole constellation of features and things that you get, and a community that is actually a community of some real value that you're willing to pay a small price for. I think the other piece we're going to see is sponsorship, which is one way that corporations are interested in attaching their names to specific content rather than on a more algorithmic base. Content and branded content. This is the piece I really see starting to move, and that is the line between what is content produced by a private company, be it American Express or Pfizer or Shell. All of these companies are hiring writers and journalists at quite a pace and creating content. The classic example in the industry right now is American Express and their open website for small business. I've done some work with them analyzing how customers use this open small business network, and actually a lot of the content has nothing to do with American Express. It's actually pretty good content written by pretty good business journalists around the issues of starting and running a small business. So branded content, I think, is going to begin to edge into what we think of as traditional content. And there's going to be a mixture there of how you put the branded content together with your journalistic content. That's a conversation I think it's just started, but that's where some of the money is going to come. Well, I could talk a lot more, but I want to leave at least a little time for questions. I told you when I started out doing new media, I would read the history of radio, because radio took so long and flailed around for so long before it got going. And that would make me feel better. But you know what? We're now past the period of time it took for radio to find a business model. So I have to look a little more broadly for inspiration. And I look at Tolstoy and this story, of all people, Tolstoy. Tolstoy, right towards the end of his life, when he was probably one of the 5 most famous authors in the world, back when being a famous author really meant something, he was alive when the Lumiere brothers in Paris invented the motion picture, or at least the first really commercial motion picture. And those of you who follow movies know well the Lumiere brothers. Huge cameras, you basically could only do about a 10, 15-second clip at a time. But they did that, and their most famous movie was where they set the giant camera up next to a railroad track, where the train coming in, and the whole 10-second clip is the train getting bigger and bigger and bigger, coming right towards the camera and then zooming by. That was their big hit. And they toured the capitals of Europe, showing this. And they finally got to Russia. They were French. Russians loved everything French, so they set up and were showing it in Moscow, and Tolstoy came to look. Now, the story was that in a number of these showings, when they showed the locomotive video, people jumped out of their chairs because just naturally they fell out of their chairs. They say that Tolstoy did not fall out of his chair, but he did say afterwards, "I was born 50 years too soon," because he realized in that simple 10-second demo, the incredible opportunity for narrative that was going to come along with this motion picture. And even though he'd made his name on paper, he really wished he'd had a chance to be born 50 years later. None of us can say that. We're right in the middle of it. So it's our challenge to meet. Thank you.